Hi everybody, Andrew Cuneo here. Kamigawa Neon Destiny is about to be released in the coming days, and I've been going over the spoiler and I've been brewing up all the decks you're going to see on my channel coming in the next week. I wanted to go through and give you a list of my top 5 picks for cards that are going to show up primarily in Alchemy decks. This will also be applicable to Standard, maybe a little bit in Historic. I'm not going to touch on how the cards might affect any of the older formats that aren't on Arena. So with that, let's jump into the top 5. And we're going to start out with what I'm going to say is an honorable mention. Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance. This is part of a cycle of legendary lands. There's one for each color. And I'm making this an honorable mention because if I didn't, honestly, this would probably just easily be the number 1 on the list. Really, all 5 of the lands might be the top 5 cards for impact. Because what they are is they're a legendary land that doesn't come into play tapped, and they tap for the mana of their color. So Sokenzan is going to tap for red. So there's really no drawback to having 1 copy of this in every monocolor or 2-colored deck. And the advantage you get is they all have a channel ability. In the case of Sokenzan, it's red and 3 channel, meaning discard the card. And then you get an effect. Create 2 1/1 colorless spirit creature tokens. They gain haste until end of turn. There's also this really minor bit of text that this ability costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature you control. So mostly you're just going to, it's kind of like a 4-mana version of Raise the Alarm, but it's attached to a land. So if you don't want to cast Raise the Alarm, you could play this as a land, and it doesn't come into play tapped. So there's no real drawback, at least to the first copy. So I think, like I said, every monocolor or 2-color deck is going to feature at least 1 copy of each of these lands in their appropriate colors. The real question is going to be, are decks going to play more than 1 copy? And I think in the case of Sokenzan, the answer is yes. The red decks and 2-color red creature decks are going to play more copies of this. That's why I've chosen this as the one to represent the entire category. I think it's the one that's going to be strongest in Standard. So the reason that I think it's going to be so strong is because red has an ability class called Modified, where it wants you to have creatures and it wants you to equip equipment to them or put counters on them. So the fact that this is just giving you 2 bodies at instant speed with haste that you can attach your equipment to is going to matter a lot in decks with equipment. Also, they're spirits, which doesn't matter that much, but we're going to get to it in a second. I do think that you might be able to build a tribal spirit deck with one of the other cards on the list. So this card, it's just kind of free value attached to a land, and it's not even like the lands from Zendikar Rising, where you were going to have to pay life to get them into play untapped, or they were just going to always come into play tapped. This is just straight up, the only disadvantage is if you draw multiple copies of it, you won't be able to have 2 copies of it in play as a land at the same time. Even if you just need the mana and you draw multiple copies of this, you can have 1 in play, tap it for mana, play the new one, choose that to be the one you keep from the legend rule, and just tap that one for, keep that one around, tap that one for mana. So even the additional copies can act as kind of a one-shot mana source, so it's not even that big of a drawback. So, like I said, I think this is a really easy auto-include in basically any red deck, which is why I made it an honorable mention, because it's not the most splashy card in the world, but it is just so easy to fit into any deck. Moving on to the actual list now, let's start at number 5. Number 5 is going to be Ao the Dawn Sky. This is also part of a cycle. Every color in Kamigawa has I think it's between 4 and 6 mana dragon spirit at Mythic that's a legendary creature. They all are big flyers that have a trigger that happens when they die. So Ao the Dawn Sky is white 3. You get a 5/4 flying vigilance. It's a dragon spirit. It's legendary. When it dies, you get to choose 1. So the first one's look at the top 7 cards of your library, put any number of non-land permanent cards with total mana value 4 or less from among them onto the battlefield, put the rest on the bottom of your library. Or you can choose, put 2+1/+1 counters on each permanent you control that's a creature or a vehicle. So the reason I picked this one is that the first half of the die trigger, where you can look at the top 7 cards and you can put something with total mana value 4 or less onto the battlefield. This is something where if your opponent kills this, you're still going to have a board presence after it dies. And I'm particularly interested in this in a red-white spirits deck that I've tried in the past, and I think it's gotten a bunch of new tools. So the red-white spirits deck used Catilda Dawnheart Prime to try and build a giant flying spirit with lifelink, and it also used Showdown of the Scalds. I think in particular, having AO die and hit Showdown of the Scalds is just really great. Showdown of the Scalds is a great card that hasn't seen a lot of play, partly because there just wasn't a good deck for it in Alchemy or in Historic lately, or in Standard, for that matter. But one of the worst parts of Showdown of the Scalds was the turn you cast it and sunk 4 mana into it, you weren't really adding anything to the battlefield usually. It wasn't until you got to untap and start your second turn with Showdown of the Scalds that it really started to show how great it was. With AO, if it dies and you put a Showdown of the Scalds into play, you're going to start your next turn with a Showdown that's on Chapter 2. Once you get to your main phase, it's going to be on Chapter 2. So you're still going to have the 4 cards. You're still going to be able to play them for that turn, but you're going to be getting the counters right away. So you're just going to be able to add to the board like a turn sooner than you would have been if you'd actually invested 4 mana in casting Showdown. Then Catilda Dawnheart Prime sometimes can be absolutely gigantic for 3 mana. If you've got a board that's got a bunch of spirits and enchantments, it might be, a 4-power lifelink or 5-power lifelink, or it might be even bigger. So that's another one that's just a really high impact permanent to put into play that the AO dies trigger is going to be able to hit. Also, it counts as a spirit, so it buffs up your Catilda. I think that it's just generally a pretty strong card for that deck. That's where I'm most excited about it. I'm not sure where the other Legendary Dragon Spirits are really going to find a home. They're all fine, but none of them really stand out as cards that demand to be played. AO, I would say, I wouldn't say it demands to be played, but the fact that it does have this dies trigger that you can get something really impactful into play for free with it, I think is going to be the reason that this is going to shine above the other ones. Number 4, Rabbit Battery. So red mana for an artifact, creature, equipment, rabbit. But wait, there's more. It has haste, and equipped creature gets +1/+1, and has haste, and it has reconfigure for a red mana. So reconfigure is a new mechanic that basically, this thing's going to start as a 1/1 creature, but you can pay a red, and it will effectively become an equipment that's attached to a different creature you control. You could also pay a red mana to just unattach it and hop off of your creature to become a 1/1 creature again, if for some reason you want to have a 1/1 creature to block with or attack if you want the board to be wider. You can only do that at sorcery speed, so it isn't that resilient to removal. But the reconfigurability can be used to protect yourself against sweepers, because if you're going to end your turn and you've got, 3 of these in play, you could pay the reconfigure cost and just have 2 of the rabbit batteries jump on one that will stay as a creature, and then a card like Doomscar is only going to kill 1 of your 3 rabbit batteries. So the reason that I think that this is particularly strong is twofold. First of all, red has struggled as a color, I would say, recently. Certainly mono red has struggled, and it's been because it did not have good 1-drops. There are plenty of good 3 and 4 mana creatures to put in your deck, especially in Alchemy, where you can play Townraiser Tyrant. In Standard, you've still got Reckless Stormseeker. So there are lots of good cards kind of higher up on the curve, but the 1-drops were really lacking. This card does not hit that hard as a 1-drop, but it does stay relevant throughout the entire game. The ability to, for a single mana, give any subsequent creature you cast haste, and also add +1/+1 to its power is very, very strong. So I think that this fits really nicely into a hole in the curve in red decks that was really holding them back. The other thing is there are red cards like the Thundering Kaiju that trigger off of your creatures being modified, which modified means that it has an equipment attached to it, or an aura attached to it, or a +1/+1 counter on it, and you get a benefit. So the fact that this is a very cheap way to make your creatures modified is also going to matter a lot. There's a whole bunch of equipment throughout the set that work like this, but I think this is the one that is actually the best. And it's only an uncommon, and it only costs 1 mana. But I just for raw efficiency, I don't think you can really beat this card. Number 3, the Reality Chip. So this is 1 in a blue for a legendary artifact creature equipment jellyfish. And that's all great. It says you may look at the top card of your library anytime. As long as the Reality Chip is attached to a creature, you may play lands and cast spells from the top of your library, reconfigure for blue and 2. So this works the same as the previous card, Rabbit Battery, does. This one, I'm a little bit less certain about exactly how to use it, but the ability when it's attached is extremely powerful. Sort of regardless of what type of deck you're playing, regardless of what spells you have in your deck, if you have that ability going, you're going to overpower your opponent eventually. It kind of gives you a guaranteed late game as long as you can maintain access to it. So I think there's a couple candidates for what you might want to attach it to. It's really going to depend on how you're trying to build your deck. And it's important to note that this does require you to be playing other creatures to attach it to. So it's a legendary creature. So you can't just have 2 copies of the Reality Chip and put 1 on the other one. That's not going to work. One of them will get killed before you get a chance to do that. So one thing I'm considering doing is in Alchemy, trying to attach it to a Geist Channeler. Now, Geist Channeler's ability does not really synergize with playing spells off the top of your deck, but it is just another good, cheap blue creature that can help you set up for more of a late game strategy. Another idea would be to maybe put it on Imrith, because Imrith has that ward ability when it's untapped. So that's going to give you some degree of protection for your jellyfished up creature that you're not going to want to die because you will have invested a fair amount of mana into getting to this point. So those are the 2, I think, main bodies you might want to attach it to that I've thought of initially, at least. One thing that's important to note is there's also a new Tezzeret, which it's not a body you can attach the Reality Chip to, but it is a way to make the reconfigure cost cheaper. So that is also pretty good. It might be that the Reality Chip is most at home in just a dedicated artifacts deck, and you're going to be looking for what kind of artifact bodies can you attach it to. This card, it's on the list because I think it has a lot of raw power, but I think you're going to have to play with it a fair amount to really figure out what the best way to use it is. Number 2, Reckoner Bankbuster. There is a large number of pretty good vehicles in this set, and this one stands out to me because I think it's the one that goes in the widest variety of decks. So it's 2 mana for a vehicle that's a 4/4. It has crew 3, so a pretty expensive crew cost. And then it also has the ability when it enters the battlefield, you get 3 charge counters. You can spend 2 and tap it to remove a charge counter and draw a card. Then if there's no charge counters on it, you create a treasure token and a 1/1 colorless pilot creature that crews things as though it were 2 power greater. So it crews like it's a 3 power creature, meaning that it can crew the Bankbuster on its own. So this card is sort of reminiscent of Mazemind Tome in that it's a 2 mana artifact that you can draw 3 cards off of. Mazemind Tome had a different payoff, and it also had the ability to just scry if you couldn't afford to sink more mana into it. This card's a little bit different. Rather than having the option to scry if you don't want to sink mana into it, it has the option that you can just crew it and hit your opponent for 4. That means it's going to go in kind of a different deck, I would say. I think that this is going to be most at home in mid-range decks that have 3-drops that are pretty good at crewing it, but they're not just pure beatdown decks. They're not always going to want to crew it. So I'm envisioning maybe a black deck that has like Graveyard Trespasser in it, because in that case you'll be able to, you'll be able to crew the Bankbuster on turn 3, hit your opponent for 4, but maybe as the game goes on, you decide instead of dealing 4 damage, you want the option to just draw and find more removal spells in your black deck. So I think that's the easiest home for it. One other thing about this card is I think it's going to really give control decks fits, because it comes down on turn 2. It's hard to remove because you can't kill it with sorcery speed removal that works on creatures. You can't even kill it with any sort of creature removal unless your opponent's willing to crew it. You can kill it with a card like a Braid, but I think a lot of removal in control decks just isn't going to work on this card. So you're always going to have the option of just getting all 3 draw card triggers off of it and getting the additional 1/1 body. And it's going to come down before it's going to be reasonable to counter it in a lot of games. So I think that this is a really good anti-control tool for a mid-range deck. I think it might also just be a good sideboard card for control mirrors. I don't think it's a good way to try to win the game in game 1 as a control deck. I don't think this is a very good finisher for your control deck, just because you're going to be able to pull the cards off of it, but once you decide you want to start attacking with it, your opponent's just going to have removal spells and they're going to kill it. It's not that durable. Well, it's not durable enough to be like a singleton finisher in a control deck, I would say. But overall, still a really good card. I think it's going to fit in all sorts of mid-range decks for sure. Final card, number 1, Tribute to Hirobi. This is one of the new sagas that is also a double-face card that flips into a creature. And I've got to say that for the most part, these sagas I think have been incredibly disappointing. The way that they're mostly templated is they're somewhat expensive to put out, and then you get a minor benefit for step 1 and step 2, and then chapter 3 it transforms into a creature that's not that great. And you have to remember that the way these work, they exile the turn they transform and then re-enter the battlefield, so they do not have haste. They have summoning sickness when they come back. So you have to wait another turn before you can even start attacking with the creature. They're generally incredibly slow for what they offer you. And I think when I'm looking at Magic cards, I want things that are efficient, and I want their impact to be as front-loaded as possible. So something that is really slow and gives me a bunch of like not great stuff on rate, it's really hard for that to be good enough. Because I really think the way you win in Magic is generally you want all of your value to be front-loaded on your cards as much as possible. That might sound weird because I do play a lot of control decks that they can make the game take a long time, but I think that for the most part, cards where their value is really, really backloaded, like a lot of these sagas, they just don't perform as well as cards that just say draw. I'd much rather just play a card like Memory Deluge and draw 2 cards that are going to have front-loaded power, rather than sink mana into a card that isn't going to give me card advantage. It's just going to give me backloaded value. I think you're better off just drawing into cards that you can cast right away to do things. So that's a long-winded explanation for why I hate most of the sagas. This saga really flips the script on the way the sagas are templated. So this one is cheap. It's 1 and a black, which is cheaper than most of them. So you can play it on the second turn. So that's good. If you're going to get your value backloaded, you better at least be able to get it into play very early so that it's going to do whatever it does for you pretty early on in the game. So chapter 1 and chapter 2 of this is give your opponent a 1/1 black rat rogue token. So rather than having a minor payoff, it has a straight up drawback for chapter 1 and 2. So what are we getting when we get to chapter 3? Chapter 3, we transform into the Echo of Death's Wail, a 3/3 flying haste that when it enters the battlefield, so when it transforms, you gain control of all rat tokens. So you undo the drawback of giving your opponent rat tokens. They're now your rat tokens, which is now a benefit for you. And whenever it attacks, you can sack another creature if you do draw a card, so you could potentially be sacking the rat tokens. This card, I think, is really strong. It has haste, so it is not as slow to have an impact. This, if you play it on turn 2, Chapter 3 is going to trigger on turn 4, so you're going to have a 3/3 flying haste attacking on turn 4, which isn't too bad on rate. And remember, you're also going to get whatever the rat tokens you had. The rat tokens might be tapped. They're not going to have haste, so you won't be able to attack with them on turn 4. You're potentially going to be able to sack them to draw a card, assuming that your opponent hasn't done something where they died. One thing to think about with this card is, so I'm giving my opponent a rat token, then I'm giving them another rat token. They're going to have these rat tokens for 1 or 2 turns. How much damage are they going to be able to do with them? And the answer is probably 3 at most. So assuming they're just attacking them with them as 1/1s, after Chapter 1, they're going to untap, they're going to have 1 rat, they're going to attack you for 1. After Chapter 2, they're going to take their turn, they're going to have 2 rats, they're going to attack you for 2. So that's 3 damage total. So one way to think about this card is it might be you lose 3 life in order to get Echo of Death's Wail into play. So that's really not that bad. That's going to be pretty manageable, I think, for a lot of black decks. The thing that I think makes this card so great, though, is that the way black decks mostly work in Alchemy is they want to be sacrifice decks. They want to be playing with Deadly Dispute and Sanguine Brushstroke. So they're looking for sack outlets. They're also looking for sacrifice fodder. This card gives you both. The Echo of Death's Wail is a sacrifice outlet. The rat tokens are going to be sacrifice fodder. So it just really perfectly synergizes, I think, with what black decks already want to do. The other thing about this card is that I think that the black decks are really well suited for handling the rat tokens, because obviously you want to just be able to ignore the rat tokens until you gain control of them. So the black, you don't want to put this in a deck where you're trying to attack on the ground with small creatures like on turn 1. If you put a card like Gutter Bones into play and then you played Tribute to Hirobi, that would be kind of horrible because your Gutter Bones just wouldn't be able to participate in combat until you've stolen the rat tokens back. So that's the wrong kind of deck for this. But if you're just looking to stall the game, you're not looking to attack on the ground in the early turns, then the rat tokens really don't affect you that much. The other thing to remember is that if you consider how this card would interact with Meathook Massacre or, say, a card like Blood Artist, your opponent having the rat tokens, you're potentially just going to kill them before you get them back on your side if you're worried about your life total. And you're going to have a bunch of cards in your deck that actually benefit you when you kill creatures. So Meathook Massacre, you might just gain extra life effectively by giving your opponent the rat tokens. Certainly, if you're concerned about your life total, the turn before you play the Meathook Massacre, you can play this Tribute to Hirobi. Your opponent's going to have 2 extra rat tokens. They will have potentially done 1 damage with one of the tokens, but when you play the Meathook Massacre, you're going to kill the 2 tokens and you're going to gain 2 life. So you're effectively up 1 life on that exchange. Similar thing would happen with Blood Artist, potentially. And just when you're playing one of those decks, you just want to have more material on your side. And this thing is, in some ways, a 3-for-1. It's going to give you 3 bodies for the price of 1 card, which is great with Blood Artist. It's great with Meathook Massacre, Deadly Dispute, all those cards. It just really synergizes very well. So I think this card is going to be really at home in that style of deck, which is why it's my pick for number 1 in the set. I hope you guys enjoyed this review. I hope you find it useful. And like I said at the beginning, I'm going to be making deck techs for decks using these new Kamigawa cards. They're going to start coming out probably Friday morning, maybe Thursday night if I'm really on the ball. So definitely sub to the channel and keep an eye out for those. Talk to you next time.